Good afternoon. Dr. Irma Montelongo, Chicano Studies. And I thought that for my portion of the presentation, what I would do is I would put this anti-Mexican sentiment, which is very real and has existed in Texas for a long time, into historical context. So we could try to understand what it is that ultimately transpired on August 3rd. So I want to begin with looking at sort of the story of Texas, right, or Texas, as it was called, and this idea of Texas independence, right? So we can hearken all the way back to 1836, and we can see that when Texas, becomes an independent republic, that you'll have a number of people who are arguing that this would be a war of economic freedom, right? That these Anglo-Texans are being held to ideas of economics that they don't agree with, when in reality, I would argue, these people considered themselves morally, intellectually, and politically superior, right? So that kind of creates the foundation for this anti-Mexican sentiment. And we can carry that on with the myth of the Alamo, or the Battle of the Alamo, where we continue to teach our children, our Mexican-American children, the story of the invasion of Texas as being one of freedom-loving defenders of the Alamo who are barricaded in defiance of a brutal Mexican dictator. Now, today, Texas K through 12 is already majority Latino, right? But we continue to perpetuate these myths. And again, we'll see Texas being used as a launching point for the provocation of the U.S.-Mexico War, right? Where then the Americans will take 1/3 of the Mexican empire away from Mexico. And part of this war, part of the rhetoric of this war, is to describe Mexicans as inferior. I'd like to just take a minute and pull out a couple of blurbs that I took from newspapers that are being written at this moment, right? And so you have a paper in Cincinnati that is claiming, right, that the loss of a few thousand of them, Mexicans, would not be so deplorable, right? That Mexicans will be led by this war to think that of their weakness and their inferiority. Right? So the discourse of what it means for Texas independence, of what it means for the U.S.-Mexico War, is very much grounded in a rhetoric of inferiority and of weakness on behalf of the Mexicans. The Congressional Globe, right? We must march from ocean to ocean. We must march from Texas straight to the Pacific Ocean. It is the destiny of the white race. It is the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race. So these people need to be tempered, they need to be put down at whatever cost. Right? The American Review, a Whig journal, is writing that exterminating her weaker blood should be part and parcel of this war. So we know then that as early as the 1830s, we're creating this discourse and rhetoric that is very much anti-Mexican. And it will not stop there, right? The Texas Rangers, let me back up here. The Texas Rangers, right? A police force that is actually the first Border Patrol units, when you think about it, will very much function on this anti-Mexican sentiment, right? So they're responsible for a number of deaths, and even the first massacre at Porvenir, right? So unfortunately, we have the dubious distinction now of having the worst massacre in Texas history. But prior to that, the Porvenir massacre, we saw, I think it was 17 people who are killed in that instance, right? The history of El Paso. El Paso has a very anti-Mexican history, in case you're not aware of that. And so one of the stories that I'm familiar with is in 1917, when the federal government puts a call out for contracts to expand or to create a state-of-the-art training facility, right? Immediately you have the representatives from El Paso, the senators from Texas, pushing to bring that facility to Fort Bliss. So they're offering Fort Bliss as a site that has the potential to expand and become this state-of-the-art training facility, right? So what happens is that some of the prominent men in El Paso with names like Thomason and Bassett, Kemp, these names that you can still see on signs throughout the city today, will actually form what they call a purity squad, right? And the whole point of this purity squad is to clean up the city. So they're told by the government that if you have any hopes of landing this facility, this state-of-the-art facility, you have to clean up the city. So what does that mean, cleaning up the city, right? It means targeting Mexican women who they see as a danger to the soldiers because they're potential carriers of venereal disease. Okay, so these guys then are going out on Fridays and Saturdays, and they're making citizens arrests. They're stopping women and they're holding them, and then they're calling the cops to come and pick them up. And these women then are being arrested for vagrancy. That's the charge, vagrancy, right? So if you were out after 6 o'clock in the evening, if you're a Mexican woman, we're talking 1917 in El Paso, and you're out after 6 o'clock in the evening, there's a good chance that you could be arrested for vagrancy, right? That's how they're thinking of cleaning up the city. And we can go prior to 1917. In 1901, under the leadership of Mayor Tom Lee, right, El Paso begins this concerted effort to clean up the Segundo Barrio, right? This idea that the people are contagious, they're carrying diseases, they're dirty, they don't have proper hygiene, right? So we're from 1901 to about 1920, which is the progressive movement, the progressive era. I'm sure that also ties into it. But you see this effort to clean up the Mexican city, right? So this sentiment then goes back a long, long way, right? We experience Mexican repatriation, completely tied to the Great Depression and the idea put forth by Herbert Hoover that the reason that the United States is experiencing such high unemployment rates is because Mexicans have come to the United States to take jobs away from Americans, right? Still rhetoric that you hear to this day of how our jobs are at risk because Mexican immigrants are entering the country, right? Operation Wetback in the 1950s, where you have probably one of the bigger steps of militarizing the border. So under the presidency of Eisenhower, of Dwight Eisenhower, he appoints a man by the name of Joseph Swing, who was a general in the Army, to be the head of Immigration and Naturalization Services. INS is what it's called at the time. I think today it's ICE. And Swing is a hawk, right? He's a war hawk who had participated in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa, right? So he has this very, very, very distinct attitude about the border and who are Mexicans, right? And so under him, you see this upgrade, this really huge upgrade in the Border Patrol. This is the first time that they give them a large amount of money to upgrade their equipment. This is also the time that they initiate the forest green uniforms, right? That make them look kind of more military-like. He launches this campaign that they're called Operation Wetback, which is, according to the INS, according to their press releases, between 1935 and 1955, they were deporting at least 1 million Mexicans annually, right? And so the United States kind of has this love-hate relationship with Mexico. When they need the labor, when they need the cheap labor, right, then they call for that labor to come in. But then whatever events occur or whatever change of administration you have or in sentiments that you have, that could easily flip on a dime, right? And you can go from wanting and encouraging this labor to shutting down the border, right? To this talk of walls and of fences. And in fact, it's Herbert Brownell, who is the Attorney General at the time, is talking in public about shooting wetbacks as part of Operation Wetback, right? So just shoot them. If you see them coming into the country illegally, shoot them. Okay, I think we've heard that recently as well. And I'll go ahead and at this point, I think I pulled it up somewhere.
I mean, when you have 15,000 people marching up and you have hundreds and hundreds of people and you have 2 or 3 border security people that are brave and great, and don't forget, we don't let them and we can't let them use weapons. We can't. Other countries do. We can't. I would never do that. But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that statement.
So shoot him. Somebody in the audience yells out, shoot him, right? And he chuckles. He chuckles, right? So he justifies it somehow. Okay, so we see this rhetoric then rearing its ugly head again decades later. Right? So Operation Wetback then we see when in 2016, right, when he's coming down the escalator and he's going to announce his presidency, that he refers to Mexicans as rapists and criminals. Okay? Again, this discourse that is constantly reminding us that there is this anti-Mexican sentiment, not just in the state of Texas, but in the entire country, but has a distinct history in the state of Texas, and I think that that can't be ignored. We've also been reading about the governor of Texas having written some pretty disgusting emails just a couple of days prior to the shooting, and where he's calling for Texas to stop immigrants at all cost, right? Not exactly sure what that means, but still, stop them, shoot them, right? And then there's the rally that descends on El Paso, right? That basically defines us as ground zero for this immigration plan that the administration has in place. And I don't know how many of you were present. I was at the counter rally, right? But one of the things that I noticed as we were approaching the park was that behind the Coliseum, where the equestrian center is, there were rows and rows and rows of buses. So obviously, a lot of the people that attended the rally were not from El Paso. They were bussed in, right? And I remember kind of being around the city in different parts of the city and seeing all of these red MAGA hats, right? And I was like, whoa, because you didn't see that before. And then right after, you didn't see that. And so right after the rally, I'm like, okay, where are all the red MAGA hats now? Where'd they go, right? Well, they were not from here. These were people that came in. And I think that that also speaks to what happens on August 3rd, that somebody came into our city to do this very horrible act to the residents of El Paso, right? So there's this idea of coming in to take care of the problem, right? And so this all culminates on August the 3rd at the Walmart, when 22 people lost their lives. And I don't think that there's any denying that this was a hate crime, right? I mean, he leaves the evidence behind. He uses the same words, invasion, infestation, right, that the administration is putting out. So you're hearing all sorts of arguing, right, about whether it's people that pull the trigger, or it's mental illness, or it's video games, or what have you. But we have to acknowledge that discourse and rhetoric has its consequences, right? And that if you continue to constantly put this out there to the people, that there will be somebody who will react to this discourse. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Dr. Emma Perez, but I studied with Emma, and Emma is a Foucauldian, right? She's all about Foucault. And she used to always, sort of put it straight out that discourse creates knowledge, right? And so discourse can also create very dangerous knowledge, which I think is what we experienced. When we're talking about hate, we're not just talking about one group of people hating another group of people, right? We're also talking about internalized hate. I think that that's important, internalized hate. We can go as far back as the inception, the organization of LULAC, right? And you might be familiar with LULAC, but LULAC started out as an assimilationist organization where they're encouraging Mexican Americans to speak English only, right? Where they're calling for a separation between themselves and Mexican immigrants. They feel that Mexican immigrants, the poor Mexican immigrants, are a source of job competition, right? Also a barrier to their full assimilation, to their full acceptance as American citizens in American society. So you see these divisions between Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, right? And you have an organization, and not just that organization, other organizations that are encouraging this sort of behavior, that are supporting these sorts of ideologies, right? But that hasn't changed today either. Okay? So I think we need to ask ourselves, what are the forces? What are those forces that lead to internalized dislike of one's own community, right? So is it because you're a conservative and you're pro-life? So you're pro-life as long as the life is in the womb, right? The fact that children in cages doesn't bother you? Is it the tax cuts? I mean, what is it, right? That you have certain situations like Latinas for Trump, right? I mean, how do you rationalize that when you know that this man has put a target on our backs? Because there's no denying that, right? You have people yelling at other people in public places because they're speaking Spanish, right? Latinos are, very much in a very precarious situation. And so I would like to end right there because I think my 15 minutes are up. But I don't know. I think a picture speaks 1,000 words, right? Here is a baby who's orphaned because of hatred. And thumbs up? Really? So I'd like to leave you with that thought, that hate is not just a group hating on another group, but it's also an internalized feeling that we have, some of us have, as we really push to become part of American society. An American society that I would argue right now is somewhat spinning out of control. Okay, so I think I'll hand it to Michael at this point. Thank you.
I really want to begin by saying good evening to each of you. And I sincerely hope that you are maintaining as best you can given these trying and violent times. And more importantly, that in this current environment, and when I mean current, I'm saying not only today, but the past 400 plus years, I hope that disturbs you to your core. Before continuing, I must pay honor and respect to the 22 individuals who were murdered here on August 3rd, and to the over 24 that were physically injured. We have no numbers for those who were traumatized by it, and to their families on both sides of the border. We have to stand in their names against oppression, against white supremacy, against injustice. We have to do that as a people. Now, I tend to get excited, but I'm going to move along. Again, my name is Dr. Michael Williams, and I serve as Director of the African American Studies Program and Professor in the Department of History here And I want to thank Dr. Gina Nunez-Machuri for her team and also for all who are involved in putting these 2 days of work together and all those who have participated in it. And finally, also the opportunity for me to be a part of this particular panel of racism, identity, and hate. I've come here this evening with a heavy heart, but here to do two things. First and foremost, to tell the truth. So I don't know how to do anything else. And second, to talk about the human element left in the wake of white supremacist systems. Because it's really people that we're talking about, the sufferers and the victims of these racist, oppressive systems that we have to deal with. It was Dr. John Hope Franklin who in 2005 said that we've got to tell the unvarnished truth. His words were relevant then, and they are more so today. So this evening, in the allotted time that I have, I want to speak briefly to the human element, the human consequences of racism, identity, and hate in this country, and more importantly, what it has meant historically to people of color. Now, when we think of racism, we tend to think of one person hating another or a group of people hating another one based upon race or other characteristics. But these are only manifestations of a larger problem of white supremacy and racism. It's much more complex than that. Racism and white supremacy is much more insidious in its permeation throughout this country. Racism and white supremacist ideologies, they take refuge, they fester, and they inundate every facet that makes up this society. And when left to their own devices, injustice and violence abound. Racism, as defined by noted historian Barbara Fields, is the assignment of people to an inferior category and determination of their social, economic, civic, and human standing on that basis. These are indeed critically emotional and dangerous times, but they are also times that demand resilience, courage, activism on our part in every day of our lives. And we see that here in El Paso. It means, however, that we cannot consider the murders that happened here on August 3rd as an anomaly or somehow different or separate from the larger societal manifestations and institutions that perpetuate racism and hate, not only through the words of Donald Trump and others, but more importantly in the ways that this country operates, the way it sees, and the way it responds against people of color. And we cannot be afraid to call that to the forefront. On August 3rd, a 21-year-old white male drove some 10 hours to get to a Walmart here, where he subsequently killed 22 people. People of color he targeted because he believed them to represent an Hispanic invasion of Texas. People he believed to be inferior, but a threat to the white race. People he believed he had a right to exterminate because they weren't really human beings. Because white supremacist ideologies said that they were not. Was his attack a racist one? Yes. Was it based upon hate? Definitely. But his actions were also a byproduct of a larger system of white supremacy, racism, and hatred. It's Dr. Cornel West who said we should never confuse a particular villain with a larger tradition. The white supremacy is a larger tradition, and thus, let's not confuse things. Racism is a moral issue with political consequences. Such moral issues have leftist, right-wing, and centrist versions, meaning that they are not stagnant. They are not assigned to one state or one party or one system. It's a global issue. And so racism is a part of a wider system of white supremacist oppression and violence. The many individuals who are caged along the Texas-Mexican border, the children separated from their parents, the many young black men and women and children killed, such as Emmett Till, Tamir Rice, and others. The 680 Hispanic men and women working at a series of food processing plants detained by ICE agents in Mississippi on August 7th of this year. There was no real system in place to take care of their children when this happened. All of this is a part of a racialized hatred and fear that people of color face daily that I have faced daily. There's a system of racism and hate that we must contend with in conjunction with fighting to obtain justice against those individuals who perpetuate acts of terror both violently and legislatively. Racism is the physical manifestation of the larger disease of white supremacist ideology. Activist Bettina Martinez notes that white supremacy is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white peoples and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. The issues then are one of humanity. Who is seen as human and who is not? Who benefits from society and who does not? Who gets to walk freely in this country without a care, and who leaves home daily without any real assurances that they will not be killed for being black or brown or a person of color? White supremacy is designed to protect the social status and identity of whiteness and the benefits derived from that designation at every single level. In short, then, racism and white supremacy is a global system that touts whites as the superior race and people of color as their inferiors, and they have dire consequences not only for the victims of it, but also for those individuals who internalize this hatred and then drive 10 hours to a Walmart. Scholars such as sociologist David T. Wellman argue that racism extends considerably beyond prejudiced beliefs. The essential feature of racism is not hostility or misperception, but rather the defense of a system from which advantage is derived on the basis of race. The manner in which the defense is articulated, either with hostility or subtlety, is not nearly as important as the fact that it ensures the continuation of a privileged relationship. Same time, this August marks 400 years since the 20 and odd Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, as captives and were traded for goods, and thus the beginning of what would later become America's brutal institution of chattel slavery, upon which this country amassed its economic, political, and social wealth. You can't create a system like that without racism and oppression in play. The idea of the other allowed for the placement of social, political, and economic mechanisms designed to oppress the rights and humanity of people of color. Racism and hate allowed doctors to sterilize Fannie Lou Hamer without her permission, and then put into a place systems designed to take away the reproductive abilities of black women and Latino women. Dorothy Roberts writes in Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, that during the 1970s, sterilization became the most rapidly growing form of birth control in the United States, rising from 200,000 cases in 1970 to over 700,000 in 1980. It was a common belief among blacks in the South that black women were routinely sterilized without their informed consent and for no valid medical reason. Teaching hospitals performed unnecessary hysterectomies on poor black women as practice for their medical residents. This sort of abuse was so widespread in the South that these operations came to be known as Mississippi appendectomies. Such sterilization plans would not only impact African-American women, but also Latino women and also Latino men, as these women were sterilized by the thousands across this country, but in particular within California's eugenics program during the 1920s and the 1950s. Racism and ideology of white supremacy brought about lynchings of thousands of African Americans. It allowed the Supreme Court in 1857 to rule against an enslaved man by the name of Dred Scott who was fighting for his freedom, and for Justice Roger B. Taney to exclaim that the framers of the Constitution never believed that blacks were citizens. They were not a part of that we the people. And as a result, they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic, wherever profit could be made by it. If people of color have no respected rights, including the right to life, then violent acts, such as the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 little girls, happens. The mass shooting, South Carolina, the Manual African Methodist Episcopal Church, that included the death of Reverend Clemente Pinckney, who was my wife's cousin, happens. Without that kind of respect, August 3rd happens. We have to replace systems that perpetuate oppression, racism, and injustice in the leadership of those who harbor racist beliefs and ideologies. Racism, white supremacy allowed whites to take land from Native Americans and to kill them without conscience, and to put into place programs that said, kill the Indian and save the man. You don't put programs like that without racism and white supremacy as a whole. Racism created judicial mechanisms that place African Americans and people of color in prison at greater numbers and often for longer sentences than their white counterparts. Racism allows for a system to paint people of color as animals, as rapists, as murderers, as criminals, as things to be feared, to be ridiculed, to be exploited, to be criminalized. So that with this image in mind on the TVs and the radios, it is hoped that the larger society allows for the oppressive treatment of those who have been categorized as the other or less deserving of humanity. Racism is much more than the act of one deranged individual, but rather the systemic oppression of people of color at every level, and its effects have real consequences for our children. Now I want you all to listen, and these are bright, of what these children are going through about this. This is 9-year-old Ziana Oliphant, who's speaking on racism and murder. Listen to the pain that she's going through.
I come here today to talk about how I feel, and I feel like that we are treated differently than other people, and I don't like how we're treated, and just because of our color doesn't mean anything to me. I believe that
You're doing great. You're doing a great job.
Don't stop. Do not stop.
we are black people and we shouldn't have to feel like this. We shouldn't have to protest because y'all are treating us wrong. We do this because we need to and have rights.
Go ahead. Let her talk. Go ahead.
I've been born and raised in Charlotte, and I never felt this way till now. And I can't stand how we're treated. And it's a shame that our fathers and mothers are killed, and we can't even see them anymore.
That's right.
It's a shame that we have to go to the graveyard and bury them. And we have tears, and we shouldn't have tears. We need our fathers and mothers to be by our side.
That's a 9-year-old that we talked about here. There's some pain here. You need to listen to 11-year-old Magdalena Gomez-Bradario, who caught up in this raid in Mississippi. Listen to what she has to say. Tell me if this is an assistant.
Oh my God. No, the Hispanic people are not doing nothing bad. They're not stealing nothing. I can't do nothing but please open the door for the parents. I'm stuck over there in jail. I'm not gonna have nothing. It's the first day of school for me. My dad bought everything for me to live over here. The rent, and I don't know what I'm gonna eat. And I'm so hungry right now. I need my dad for me. My dad didn't do nothing. He's not a criminal. So the government, please put your heart. Let my parents be free with everybody else, please. Don't leave the child with cryiness and everything.
Some pain here. Don't leave the child with cryiness. As I conclude here, so I can turn it over to my colleague, You need to remember that there are living, breathing, and generational human elements of victimization that suffer from the manifestations of racism and white supremacy. There's real people here. That we must understand, that we must feel, that must tell us when something is wrong. There's a world outside of this city of El Paso waiting on us to help address the issues of injustice, racism, repression, and hate. And there are elements outside who hope that we never do. How do you combat racism, identity politics, and hate? First, you understand your responsibility to challenge it. Then you get prepared. You call it out for what it is, where it is, and when it is, and not be afraid to stand against the grain of your own comfort. There are living, breathing, and generational human beings of victimization that suffer from racism and white supremacy who demand that we see the struggles of our brothers and sisters as our own. There's a need for us to understand that we the just, hold the power and responsibility to change society. The power and responsibility to protect the community. The power and responsibility to stand fully upright in the presence of evil, racism, white supremacy, and work diligently toward their end. We cannot forget that there are living, breathing, and generational human elements of victimization suffering from the system of racism, white supremacy, who demand our attention because those who are victimized by it never get over that loss associated with it, the inhumanity experience, nor the failure of those who see but do not challenge the injustices on their behalf. In the words of Petita Martinez, by, quote, not understanding that racism is systemic, we guarantee it will continue, end quote. That, ladies and gentlemen, we have to stop. Finally, in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, sometimes it seems like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. I'm not backing down. I'm not backing off. And neither should we. Thank you.
So I know people say this all the time, like that's a tough act to follow, but oh my, that's just, I'm sure none of you envy me in this moment. That was great, Michael. Thank you for that. I also want to get in line and thank Gina Nunez for putting this together. You know, shortly after the events of August the 3rd, she jumped into action. It's what Gina does, and she's easily the hardest working person at UTEP. And so really appreciate this, Gina, and giving me the opportunity to come up here. Contrary to what you might think, we're not going to be talking about Shakespeare because people hate Shakespeare, right? But really talk about some of what Michael discussed in terms of the long legacy of hatred, right, and of racism. And as somebody who teaches Shakespeare and focuses on critical race studies of Shakespeare, I feel the obligation is to implicate him in that process, right? What does Shakespeare do? How has he been used as a tool of colonialism? And rather importantly, how is his own language helping shape these perceptions here, right? You know, in the words of Kim Hall, he helped to shape the language of white supremacy through his plays here, right? In, you know, pitting moral superiority, right, firmly in the realm of perceptions of fairness, whiteness, right, and that's what he does. So my own work looks at Latinx intersections with Shakespeare, and so I want to talk a little bit about that today, a little bit about, you know, what's been transpiring at least in my world of Shakespeare here, right, prior to the events of August the 3rd, and then, you know, rather distinctly, really not how Shakespeare can help us think about it, but how we can utilize Shakespeare, use Shakespeare as a vehicle, right, to seemingly, you know, engage these particular issues of racism and have productive conversations that I think need to be happening in our classrooms. So I want to begin with you know, one of the more popular, I guess, intersections of Shakespeare and Latinx culture, and that's through Dolores Huerta. In 2006, Dolores Huerta went to Tucson High School to speak to the students, and the reason was there was a lot of anti-immigrant legislation taking shape there, right? Anti-Latinx legislation, and she was essentially protesting SB 1070, speaking to the students, the high school students, and encouraging them, right, to engage in the civic process here, right, and really kind of, you know, make themselves be heard. She said to these students, you know, you need to know that Republicans hate Latinos. Those were her words. Republicans hate Latinos in that auditorium. And Tom Horn, who was the superintendent of Tucson ISD at that time, was infuriated. He was a Republican, and his response to that was swift. He said, we need to go out there and have a corrective to this. So he sent his top aide to go and speak to those students, to call another assembly, another rally, right, to explain to them that Republicans did not, in fact, hate Latinos, right, but like Latinos very much. As she went to speak to them, the students turned around and, in their own protest, they raised their fists in the air and did not listen to her here, right? Tom Horn was infuriated. This set off the firestorm, right? He proceeded to try to dismantle the Mexican American Studies program at Tucson Independent School District here, right? And that became the impetus. And that was almost a decade-long legal battle here, right? Where essentially it was dismantled. And, contrary to belief, they didn't ban books themselves, but they made it so impossible to teach certain works of literature, right? That those books, and that teachers had to come together and say, we simply cannot teach these particular texts here, right? And so some notable titles are up here. Why do I bring this up? Well, enter Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare's The Tempest was one of the books on the list. And part of the ruling suggested that if any of the conversations in class broach the topic here, right, of racism, if you can believe it here, right, of racism, then those particular teachers will be held accountable, right? And of course, if you're familiar with The Tempest, it deals with a monstrous figure named Caliban here, right, is considered half fish, half human. Truly, what it is a representation either of Native American here, right, or an African, and this is what Shakespeare is attempting to address in that play, issues of colonization here, right? But because these teachers did not feel comfortable, in other words, it's not even them going up there and saying like, today we're going to talk about colonialism, right? But rather we're going to be talking about the Tempest, and if a student raises his hand, and the teacher turns to him and say like, I see some remnants of colonialism here. Already that teacher is found in violation of that law and could lose her or his job in that moment, and so they couldn't teach it. Why does this matter? Because Shakespeare sells. Like, no one really cares about Dagoberto Gilb here, right, in terms of the bigger society. People aren't paying attention to that, unfortunately, and they should be, and that's what this program is teaching here, right? But when Shakespeare was part of that conversation, suddenly people listened. They were like, whoa, you can't ban Shakespeare here, right? You can't think about that. I love Dagoberto Gilb, by the way, and his work is fantastic, and all of these works are fantastic. I want to make this clear, like, Shakespeare's lucky to be alongside these particular pieces of literature. I want to make that absolutely and fundamentally clear. I mean, the fact that I'm teaching Shakespeare through this paradigm should tell you, I don't think Shakespeare has enough here, right? I mean, we don't need to be teaching Shakespeare. You heard me say it. Not good for job security here, right? But we do in some ways, right? We do. We have to, dismantle it, by using the tools of our Father here, right? And in some way, the Master, I'm sorry. And in some ways, right, this is where Shakespeare stands within this particular dynamic, and it's important. It's important for us to consider that here, right? What I think about with Shakespeare, and what I've been, kind of coming through my mind again prior to these events, is the issue of white rage here, right? And how this dynamic is found through his plays and through the teaching of his plays. And so Carol Anderson, quoting from her book, White Rage, she writes, "White rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a range of government bureaucracies. It wreaks havoc subtly, almost imperceptibly, too imperceptibly certainly, for a nation consistently drawn to the spectacular, to what it can see. It's not the Klan. White rage doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, or take to the streets. Working the halls of power, it can achieve its ends far more effectively, far more destructively." Right? She goes on to say, what is the trigger for white rage? And really, she's working off of the dynamic of black rage, right? The fact that media's attention to black rage is so prominent, right? Anytime there are protests, it's like, well, they're in a rage here, right, because of this. And what is actually being protested is the killing of unarmed black men and women, right? Paradigms of racism, right, that allow for this, and no justice in that case here, right? And when thinking about this, right, she comes to this particular dynamic, and she says, the trigger for white rage inevitably is black advancement. It is not the mere presence of black people that is the problem. Rather, it's blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It was no mistake that Tom Horn went after that particular program. The year after it was dismantled, the Mexican American Studies program, a University of Arizona report came forward with the information that those who were partaking in the program had higher graduation rates from high school and higher college enrollment. In other words, it wasn't the fear of the overthrow of the U.S. government that was at stake in that particular program, right? It was a fear of educated Latinos and Latinas here, right? That was a dynamic. That's what Tom Horn was protesting. That's the white rage that we have to face on a consistent basis here, right? And confront on a consistent basis. And these narratives are reified over time here, right? And certainly Shakespeare is used as a model for that. I'm going to show you a clip here briefly. Sorry, let me set this up. This is from Baz Luhrmann's adaptation of Romeo and Juliet in the 90s. And so Baz Luhrmann had the idea to update Romeo and Juliet and, you know, set it in something akin to Miami or Los Angeles. It was an unidentified kind of cosmopolitan city right on the coast. And it was actually filmed in Mexico City, but that's beside the point. And it's kind of, I mean, I'll just say it, it's an updated version of West Side Story here, right? You have, you know, the Capulets are darker skinned here, right? The Montagues are light skinned here. And so I want to show you, this is the kind of opening montage here. Oops, let me see, let me go back to this. Sorry about that. Oops. Let me see if I can get that.
Of the House of Capulet moves me! I heard shots from the ground. Check it out. Adler's excrement in urinal! Go rock! The boys!
All right, so they get to the gas station here and then confront here the Capulets.
Bubble, bubble, toil in trouble! And I am a pretty piece of flesh, I am! Flesh! Here comes up the House of Capulet. Coral, I will back thee.
I will bite my thumb at them, which is a disgrace to them if they bear it. Huh?
Go forth, I will back thee! Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? I do bite my thumb, sir! Do you bite your thumb at us? Sir. Is the law of our side if I say aye? No! No, sir, I do not bite my thumb at you, sir, but I bite my thumb, sir! Do you quarrel, sir? Quarrel, sir? No, sir! But if you do, sir, and for you I serve as good a man as you! No better? Here comes our kinsman, say better! Yes, sir, better! You lie! Drive you me mad! Port fools, you know not what you do! Put up your swords!
What art thou drawn among these heartless hinds? Turn thee, Benvolio, and look upon thy death.
I do but keep the peace. Put up thy sword. Or manage to depart these men with me.
Peace? Peace? I hate the word. As I hate hell, all Montagues. And thee.
Okay, So as you can see in this montage here, right in this opening, you have the fair-skinned Montagues, the darker-skinned Capulets here, right? But it's clear that one is benign, right? The kind of fumbling white kids with guns here, right? Rapping, going forward, and the other is fearsome. Right, you have the perpetuation of narratives here, right, of the Latinxes being the ones that are actually dangerous here, right. John Leguizamo does an excellent job of playing Tybalt in this here, right. But Baz Luhrmann, consciously or not, is falling into that particular trap here, right, where you perpetuate these particular myths about who is deemed dangerous here, right, and who is deemed, innocuous in this particular way here, right. And as if you notice here, I mean, this for me in terms of what we see here, and I'm thinking about Barbara Fields actually. Barbara and Karen Fields in Racecraft here, when she talks about and she writes about this notion of how we imagine, right, pigment affecting, the way that you're perceived here, right, and racism. And it's not just about the seen object, right, but the seeing subject here, right. What does that individual see? We're positioned to look at that through the eyes of that blue-eyed kid here, right. This is what we're looking at here, right. He doesn't point the gun again at the rival gang, but at an innocent, well-dressed, blue-eyed boy. Innocent, well-dressed, blue-eyed boy here, right? That's the threat that Latinxes pose. And popular culture and Shakespeare is often used, right, deliberately or not, to continue this particular conversation, right? In 2018, 2 summers ago, I was part of a race and Shakespeare symposium at Shakespeare's Globe in London. And in that particular event here, right, they were staging Othello, I'd say 2019. That should be 2018. We're in 2019 now. Yeah, last year, sorry. That was 2018, actually. So Andre Holland, some of you might recognize him from Moonlight. He played the lead role in Othello, and it was exciting. We were going, I'd gone with my good friend Ayanna Thompson to go and watch this play, and wanted to see what was up here, right? And so you have, if you're familiar with Othello, it's a racist play. I mean, there's no other way to say it. From Ayanna Thompson's perspective, she says that there are three plays in the Shakespeare canon that are toxic. In other words, that we should kind of stay away from. And people try to do them again and again and again. And they are The Merchant of Venice, Othello, and Taming of the Shrew. And I guarantee you 99% of directors say, like, I can get it right. I can humanize this person, right? I can lend some kind of weight to Catherine and Taming of the Shrew, and it won't be so misogynistic. And every single time it fails. There was Michael Sauer just this past summer toured Europe and looking at the Merchant of Venice here and at different locales, Denmark, Germany, and other places across Europe. And he would give the audience questionnaires beforehand to ask about, what they thought of anti-Semitism, right, and how they felt, if they felt they were anti-Semitic, and then give that same questionnaire after watching The Merchant of Venice. And if you could believe it, they were more anti-Semitic after the play than they were before. So it's not serving any purpose aside from perpetuating this racist feelings. Now, this experience was unbelievable. Standing there, Mark Rylance, who played the Iago character, was kind of like a bumbling idiot, which is weird. It would have served some purpose if it was like, I just want to make people like me. I'm charismatic and kind of benign, and then turn to the audience and say, like, I'm actually really evil. But throughout, he was just kind of like a likable character, and people were leaning into the laughter in a tragedy. People were leaning into the laughter, so much so that as the play got rolling, people were leaning into the laughter when it came to racist commentary. It was just such an uneasy feeling. I mean, Ayanna looked at me and she was just like, I'm just going to quote her. She's like, are you believing this shit, right? And it was this moment when it was like, this is so unbelievable. She actually, we ran into, the gifted actor Andre Holland after the performance, and it was heavy on him here, right? So we had a drink with him, and she was like, look, I'll contact you, right? And the reason is Ayanna Thompson is known within the kind of acting circles as the Othello whisperer. She's often called in for productions of Othello to talk to the actors beforehand, and then mid-run every time. And for big companies, I'm talking like the RSC, like will employ her to do this, mid-run to come and talk to the actor playing Othello, right? Because almost every single production, black actors have a mental breakdown halfway through, and the reason is the racism they experience from the audience here, right? Playing this character who experiences racism within the play, and then experiencing the racism without, and it often is too much. And so she'll come in and as she says, right, the first thing I tell them is like, are you feeling this? And they're like, yeah. She's like, you're not alone. This isn't unique to you. Like, this is what it is. for me, on the outside, this is it. I mean, this is what Michael was talking about in terms of like thinking about the human component here, right? Thinking about the actors who have to go through this here, right? Thinking about, quite frankly, the scholars of color who have to stand in front of classrooms here, right? Where they are the only person of color here, right? And teaching a play like Shakespeare and people saying like, that's not what Shakespeare is. You're not getting it. It's universal. Right? He teaches themes about humanizing individuals. So when you look at The Merchant of Venice, you think like that, but that's the play that hath not a Jew eyes, right? I mean, he's looking at that character, but they're forgetting that the entire play is full of racists, and they're not paying attention to that. And the comedic resolution to that play depends on the racism and the subjugation of women. And so this is where I think this kind of conversation comes into play. What do we do with this here, right? How do we teach this in our classrooms? How do we confront racism? She calls them the toxic plays, but she's not suggesting like, let's take them out of the canon. She's saying, if you're gonna engage with it, you have to engage with it responsibly. And that is of absolute importance. Of absolute importance. I can tell you, the more I talk about critical race studies in Shakespeare, the more hostile my student evaluations become. And that's it. I'm a Latino with some ambition, right? And that is fearsome in some regards here, right? And I feel that cannot stop us though here, right? Certainly not. Prior to August the 3rd, Steve Bannon, a Shakespeare aficionado himself here, right? Jackass. He came in and he brought, a team to build a half-mile of wall along a mountainside. We can see that particular mountainside from our backyard, right? My wife Andrea and I, and we were sitting there one night. We were like, "What is that road over in Juárez?" And we were like, "That's not a road." And I was like, "Holy smokes, that is the wall that he built." It is, in no uncertain terms, this big symbol of inhospitality. But as Michael suggested as well, and as Irma suggested as well here, right? These were outsiders coming in to build that. This isn't our community. These are people coming in from without to tell us, you should fear this here, right? I think more than ever, this is a time when this community needs to come together and truly, truly resist, right? And that's part of it in terms of resisting. So thank you for your time here. I don't know if, yeah, Gina.